Well, good day. My name is George Tomek, and I'm an alumnus of WKY-TV, and I'm very glad to tell you about how I got to WKY-TV and my time at WKY-TV specifically. I went to OCS, spent 3 years on active duty on the USS Hull, DD 945. It was a great experience for me. I came back, and lo and behold, I was contacted by Bruce Hinson, who had moved from KOTV in Tulsa to WKY-TV in Oklahoma City. And Bruce said, "George, there's an opening for somebody to do the weekend news. Why don't you apply for it?" I said, well, just got back off active duty and everything like that. Well, I auditioned for the job. I got it. And the rest has been history. And I've really enjoyed my time at WKY-TV. It really kind of anchored me as to what really TV news was all about. Let's go back to the beginning, the way TV news was here in Oklahoma City in 1966, because that's virtually the way it was in virtually every other market around the country. But Channel 4, WKY-TV, they really did it right. The news director was a gentleman who I've told repeatedly over the years was the best news director I ever had and one of the best all-around human beings that I've ever known. That's Ernie Schultz. We also had a great general manager at the time, Norm Bagwell, a former career FBI executive who was a tremendous general manager. When I came to work at Channel 4 in 1966, there was no videotape, there was no live capability, there was only film. And we learned how to shoot film. Each one of us we were reporter photographers. We weren't just reporters or photographers, although we did have people who were strictly photographers. But the reporter photographers had their own Bell & Howell hand camera. And I got to use it. I got to really love it. Not quite as much as my wife, but I really learned how to love it. We learned how to edit with it. Ernie had prepared a film showing you how to put a film together. In other words, we had to put a film together kind of like we were editing for a Hollywood movie. We had to make sure the screen direction was followed. We had to make sure if we were interviewing somebody that we didn't have them facing the wrong direction. Next time you look at a movie and seeing whether or not the horses leave in that direction and then come back going in this direction, that's what screen direction is. If you left in that direction, the next scene, they had to be coming through the same direction. So, we learned how to do that. We had a meeting every morning. It was called the morning meeting. And that's where we kind of plotted out the whole day. At the time, we had a noon show, we had a 6 p.m. show, we had a 10 p.m. show. And then on weekends, we had a 10 p.m. Sunday night show, and we had generally a 6 and 10 o'clock Saturday show. So it wasn't 24/7. There was no live capability, no videotape, no live capability, no internet at the time. The stories that we covered on WKY-TV, and basically it was the same way at KWTV and KOCO-TV, but I think we did it much better at Channel 4. We covered the stories that were important to the biggest audience that we had. We covered the school board. We covered the city council meeting. We covered the legislature every day when it was in session. We covered all the kingmakers. We had covered all the queenmakers. We did the big stories. The feature stories we did were feature stories for a broad interest. Now you got to remember, back in 1966, there were no consultants around, and the consultants came along a little bit later. One of the feature stories that I really remember was one of the first stories I did for Ernie. He sent me out with my trusty Bell & Howell camera to a barn in southwest Oklahoma City where somehow a horse had climbed up into the loft. Don't ask me how to do it, but it was how he did it, but it was there. The horse was on the loft, and so I called back on the two-way in the car to Ernie that this is what was there. We had a horse in a barn, and they're going to get a vet out. How are we going? What are we going to do? Well, anyway, This turned out to be a big story. And it turned out to be a great human interest story, because vets all over the area that saw it, and all horse lovers were really, really loved what we showed. How compassionate you have to be when you try to get a horse out of a loft on the second floor of a barn in southwest Oklahoma City. They had to anesthetize the horse, and they had to put a winch up like you were about to bring down a huge piece of crating, which of course a horse is a huge, very heavy animal. And we did it. We were able to bring the whole thing down, and I think we probably shot it in about 45 or 50 seconds, because we had a lot of stories that we had to get in that day. But that was one story that I'll never forget. In fact, a number of years later, I ran into a couple of the people who were involved in that owned the horse, and they remembered it very well. And from time to time after that, I had an occasional time when somebody would say to me, yeah, I remember, George. I remember you covered that story. That was something else. Those were the kind of features that we did. We did a lot of stories about agriculture, because agriculture was and still is a very important part of the economy of Oklahoma and most other states. One of the tenets that I really learned from my early days at Channel 4 was that there were generally two sides to every story, even if there weren't, obviously. Sometimes there were more than two. So I always try to make sure that we got the story right and before we put it on the air. And that's something, unfortunately, that you can't do anymore because of the fact that this is a 24/7 news cycle now in every city in the country. In fact, every country around the world. You can go live at any time you want to. And if you know somebody's going to be going with something, the rest of the stations almost have to go with it, and that has led to the term pack journalism, because that's what really it's become as far as a lot of that is concerned. But again, we covered all the stories that were really important we thought to our viewers in the greater Oklahoma City area, because we were a greater than Oklahoma City station. We really covered stories all the way from northeast Oklahoma down to the southwest, and all the way from the Panhandle to southeast Oklahoma. Ernie really enjoyed flying, and I know that he's mentioned some of his exploits flying in his Mooney. He took me out the first time he took me flying. He warned me. He said, now George, he said, I've got a Mooney, and when I push this lever, it was a manual landing gear, and it's going to make a loud siren type of noise. Don't worry about it, it's natural. So Ernie, as we were about to land, Ernie pushed the lever, and yes, the loud siren came up, and we landed at Expressway Junction Airport, which is where Ernie used to fly in and out of. And yes, like Ernie said, he used to drop the film that he shot inside of a padded couple of pillows that were taped together, and it was quite an exploit. Ernie was quite a bombardier about dropping that film. That was quite an experience. I remember we had some real fun moments too, although they perhaps weren't much fun at the particular time. Remember one time we used to have the dreaded black news set, which was really quite effective. We had the news anchor was out in front, the weather person was behind him, and because there were only men at the time, and the sports guy was over here. It was kind of like a triangle type of thing. Well, the anchor person, the anchor man, always started the newscast off, and we always wore a lavalier microphone, which is a big, heavy, ugly-looking microphone that was fastened with a clasp. One evening, Jack Ogle, great anchor, said, "Good evening, everybody," and the microphone fell off. Well, Jack reached down, picked it up. He started laughing, didn't know what to do. But Consummate Jack Ogle said, "This has never happened to me before. Let's go to a commercial so I can see if I can compose myself." Only Jack could have played that and pulled it off properly. Oliver Murray was a great fella, and I'd like to see him more nowadays, because he had a raspy voice that you probably already heard. Well, Oliver always liked to be the center of attention, whether he's on the field, out in the field doing a story, running a camera, running the production truck, or coming back inside and chortling like a magpie, just walking around the room. One day we were sitting around, and Oliver was yakking away and we had a fella there that Channel 4 that used to like to answer the telephone first. And so somebody called one day, and it was some kind of a call, and the guy was getting nettled because Oliver kept talking away as Oliver normally did. And so the guy turned around and said, "Be quiet, everybody. Somebody's life may be in danger." And Oliver said, "Ooh, somebody gonna die." Well, I remember that very well. I've thought about this experience I had more than once. For a long time, I did the weekend news at Channel 4 in the 60s. And when you did the weekend news, oftentimes you had to go out and shoot some of the film yourself. You had to come back and process it. You had to edit it. Of course, you had to script it, and then you had to put it on the air. Well, on Saturday nights, for years and years and years, Danny Williams used to do championship wrestling. And one Saturday evening, I brought some film back, and the other photographer was out doing something else, and I had to process the film. We all had to learn how to process film back then also. Well, I put the film in the processor, and it broke in the dry box. I know this has happened to other people at Channel 4. I'm just trying to tell you what happened to me when it happened with me, when I had to do it. I was the cook and bottle washer one Saturday night. I didn't know what to do. I got the film out, and I said, well, maybe we can get somebody to help us. So I went down, and we talked to some of the wrestlers who were getting ready to go out and wrestle, and see if we could get them to help us, dry the film. And the only way to dry the film was to take it out in the parking lot, and they'd have to string it, like rope and run around, and because it was in summertime, as I recall, and it wasn't very windy. So it was funny. If you could picture some of these wrestlers in tights, Spider Al Galento, Tarzan White, I don't remember their names, but they were all said, "Sure, we'll be glad to help you, George. Anything we can do to help." So they took it out there, and I can still picture these guys running around like they are would-be members of the Bolshoi Ballet, carrying this film around gingerly, trying to help us get the newscast together at 10 o'clock. That was something that I will never forget. I had spent 4 years as news director at Channel 4 from 1976 to 1980, and it was a tough time. I enjoyed it, and I'm glad I did it, but it was not the easiest time. There was one thing that I was very happy about during that time. I was able to hire some really top-notch people. I was able to hire Linda Cavanaugh. Linda and her husband had just come back from Virginia, where he had gotten his doctorate degree in economics from the University of Virginia. And Linda tried to go back to her old employer, Channel 5, and they didn't have an opening for her, and so she came to me, and I grabbed her because I knew she was a unique talent, and she was. She was a tremendous on-the-air talent and a very tenacious reporter. And Linda's been there ever since. She was just a wonderful asset, and Channel 4 is really lucky to have her all these years. I also hired another woman, a young lady who was working for WKY Radio News, another graduate of the University of Oklahoma School of Journalism, Bella Shaw. And Bella was with us for 2 or 3 years, and and she was really an on-air person and a hard-working person. She ended up out on the West Coast working for CNN with it was kind of a female Huntley Brinkley. Bella was on the West Coast and there was another lady on the East Coast, and they went back and forth covering stories, various category stories. Those were the pleasant moments I had as news director. And again, I couldn't be Ernie Schultz, but there is only one Ernie Schultz. One of the real advantages about being in a television market, working for a television station as a reporter and or an anchor, is the fact you get to meet a lot of interesting people. I've gotten to meet every governor from the state of Oklahoma, from J. Howard Edmondson in 1960 to the current governor, Mary Fallon, when she was both a congressman and also a state representative, and most of the legislative leaders down through the years. I also had an opportunity to, and I also had the opportunity to attend a number of national political conventions. The Republican Convention in Chicago in 1960, when I worked for KOTV, and the 1968, 1972, 1976, 1980, and 1984 Democratic conventions, all the way from the riot-torn convention in Chicago in '68 to the convention in 1984 in San Francisco, where the Democrats nominated Geraldine Ferraro, the late Geraldine Ferraro, as the vice presidential nominee. And that was a historic moment as far as I was concerned. I also got to meet a lot of interesting people that were not in politics. One of the most impressive people I ever met was Bud Wilkinson. I met him in 1961. He was addressing a Lions Club luncheon in downtown Tulsa. It was right after President Kennedy had named Bud as the head of his newly formed President's Council on Physical Fitness. Bud was the most impressive human being I ever met, man or woman. He was quite an impressive figure, just a tremendous person. Another very impressive person I met was Charlton Heston. I got an opportunity to meet him in the 1960s when he and another actor, Leif Erikson, were coming through talking about various issues. I talked to Mr. Erikson about violence on television because that was coming into the fore. And I also talked to Charlton Heston about politics, actors and actresses being more active in politics. It's when Ronald Reagan was governor of California and moving up the ladder as far as that's concerned. Another very interesting person I met was Art Linkletter, one of the most beloved personalities that television and radio has ever spawned. And we talked the full gamut, from the zany kids that he had on. His kids say the most stupid or difficult or funny things, and people are funny, to the really serious side of his life. And that's the fact that we talked at some length about his daughter who had committed suicide because of the scourge of drugs. So I can remember some really pleasant moments, and I can remember some really tough moments about human nature and the way society has kind of transcended from the very beginning of my television career to where I am right now, kind of looking back and doing some other things right now. It's been a wonderful ride. Kind of like Ronnie K. said, I haven't worked a day in my life. Well, I kind of have, but it's been fun. You know, looking back on all these years, I really am proud that I was able to be a part of what a wonderful legacy WKY-TV has been. And I've worked around people like Jack Ogle and Jerry Adams, Bob Berry Sr., heck of a golfer, and Steve Powell, Foreman Scotty. I remember seeing that show every day walking into the studio when I had to walk into the studio for something. Those days are long gone, but fortunately there is the internet to keep it all alive. So I hope you've enjoyed it.